Calvin Monroe sat in the back row of the gallery, the hood of his faded brown sweatshirt pulled just far enough forward to shadow his face. He didn't look like a man who spent his days in the marbled halls of the Supreme Court, and that was exactly the point. For months, handwritten letters had been piling up on his desk in Washington, all describing the same grim reality in this specific county, a court where the law was a weapon used against the poor, and where Judge Thomas reigned with a cold, smiling indifference. Calvin had spent his career writing the precedents that were supposed to prevent this, but the letters suggested his work was being ignored at the ground level. He had to see it for himself, without the filter of a formal judicial inquiry or a high-level briefing. The air in the courtroom was stale, smelling of old coffee and damp paper. Calvin watched as the morning docket began, noting how the bailiffs treated the people coming through the doors. There was a casual roughness to it, a lack of basic dignity that usually signaled a deeper rot in the system. When Judge Thomas entered, he didn't carry the solemnity of the office. He walked in with a smirk, glancing at the gallery as if he were an actor looking at an audience he didn't respect. He sat down and immediately began rushing through cases, barely looking at the defendants and cutting off their explanations with sharp, condescending remarks. Calvin took mental notes of every violation of protocol. He saw a young woman tried without being offered counsel and an elderly man fined an amount that was clearly beyond his means for a minor ordinance violation. Every time a defendant tried to speak about their rights, Judge Thomas would lean forward, his smile widening into something predatory, and tell them that his courtroom didn't have time for constitutional theories. It was a factory of conviction, designed to generate revenue and maintain a hierarchy of fear. Calvin felt a cold anger settling in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced so viscerally in years of reviewing dry legal briefs. As the morning wore on, Calvin realized that Judge Thomas wasn't just incompetent, he was intentionally cruel. He seemed to enjoy the moment when a defendant realized they had no voice. The letters hadn't exaggerated the systemic bias. The law was being twisted into a tool for personal ego. Calvin adjusted his hood, his eyes fixed on Thomas. He had come here to observe, to see if the high-level rulings he helped craft were actually reaching the people who needed them most. The answer was written in the defeated posture of every person who walked out of that courtroom. He knew then that simply writing a report wouldn't be enough. He needed to be part of the record. The court clerk called the next case, and a young woman, barely out of her teens, stepped to the podium. She was trembling, holding a stack of hospital bills as evidence of why she had missed her previous court date for a minor fix-it ticket. She tried to explain that her child had been in the emergency room, but Judge Thomas didn't even look at the paperwork she held out. He leaned over the bench, a tight, practiced smile on his face, and asked her if she thought the county operated on her personal schedule. When she tried to speak again, he told her to be quiet before he added a contempt charge to her fines. He doubled her original penalty and gave her 30 days to pay, knowing full well she had just explained she was broke. Calvin watched from the back row, his hands folded inside the pockets of his hoodie. He saw the woman's spirit break in real time. As she walked away, Thomas made a snide comment to the court reporter about creative excuses, sparking a low ripple of laughter from the bailiffs. It was a pattern that repeated with every person who stood before him. A man in a work uniform tried to contest a noise ordinance violation, citing the specific city code. Thomas cut him off mid-sentence, laughing and telling the man that he didn't need a lawnmower mechanic to explain the law to him. He dismissed the defense without a second thought and moved to the next name on the list. The judge's behavior was a masterclass in the abuse of power. He used humor as a weapon, making light of people's livelihoods and freedoms to entertain his staff. He ignored basic rules of evidence and denied requests for public defenders with a wave of his hand, claiming the cases were too simple to waste taxpayer money on lawyers. Calvin noticed that the more articulate a defendant tried to be, the more aggressive Thomas became. He hated being questioned, and he hated when anyone showed a spark of knowledge regarding their own rights. He wanted total submission, and he used his position to ensure he got it. By noon, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. Calvin had seen enough to fill a dozen ethics complaints. He watched as Thomas belittled an elderly veteran over a property dispute, mocking the man's hearing aid and telling him to keep up or get out. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was the entire point of the proceedings. Thomas enjoyed being the most powerful person in the room, and he clearly believed that the people passing through his court were too small to ever make him pay for his conduct. He had no idea that the quiet man in the brown hoodie was recording every word, every sneer, and every violation of the judicial oath in a mind trained to hold on to every detail. If you come across this video, like, comment and tell me where you are watching from. Calvin Monroe, the clerk called out, her voice flat and tired. Calvin stood up, adjusting the hood of his sweatshirt as he made his way to the front. He walked with a measured gait, his eyes fixed on the man behind the bench. This citation was his entry point, a minor, disorderly conduct charge he'd intentionally picked up by refusing to leave a public park 10 minutes after closing. It was a victimless, petty infraction, but in Judge Thomas's courtroom, it was an opportunity for theater. Judge Thomas didn't look up from his desk at first. He scribbled something on a pad, let out a long, theatrical sigh, and then finally raised his gaze. His eyes swept over Calvin's worn brown hoodie and his graying beard. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He leaned into his microphone, ensuring the entire gallery could hear his next words. "Well, look at this," Thomas said, chuckling. "I didn't know the local homeless shelter was offering legal clinics today. Are you here for a trial, Mr. Monroe, or are you just looking for a warm place to nap?" The bailiffs laughed on cue. Calvin didn't flinch. He stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the wood, and looked Thomas directly in the eye. "I am here to address the citation, Your Honor," Calvin said, his voice calm and resonant. The depth of his tone seemed to catch the judge off guard for a second, but Thomas quickly doubled down. He gestured vaguely at Calvin's clothes. "Address the citation? You look like you can barely address a bar of soap. Tell me, do you always show up to a court of law dressed for a backyard barbecue, or is this your Sunday best?" Thomas leaned back, looking around the room for approval. He was playing to the crowd, using Calvin's unassuming appearance to reaffirm his own status. He didn't see the man who had spent decades debating the finest points of the Constitution. He saw a person he could easily diminish. "I expect a certain level of decorum in my courtroom, Mr. Monroe," Thomas continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "But I suppose when you're living on the taxpayer's dime, manners are the first thing to go. Why don't you tell the court what you were doing in that park? Was the library full, or were you just looking for a quiet spot to yell at the pigeons?" Calvin remained silent for a beat, letting the judge's words hang in the air. He noticed the court reporter's fingers flying over the keys, capturing every insult, every derogatory remark. This was the record he needed. "I was exercising my right to occupy a public space, Your Honor," Calvin replied. "I believe the 14th Amendment provides certain protections regarding." Thomas cut him off with a loud, sharp laugh. He slammed his hand on the bench, shaking his head. "14th Amendment? Good grief. I've got a man in a hoodie giving me a lecture on the Bill of Rights. Listen to me carefully, son, this is my court, not a law school seminar. Save the rights, talk for someone who cares. Around here, the only thing that matters is what I say." He leaned forward, his smile turning sharp. "And right now, I'm saying you look like a nuisance. Now, are we going to do this the easy way, or am I going to have to teach you some respect?" Judge Thomas leaned back in his high-back chair, his face contorted in a sneer as he watched Calvin Monroe. The courtroom was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a siren. Calvin didn't move. He stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the wood, his eyes fixed on the judge. He had just cited a complex federal statute, 42 U.S. Code Section 1983, regarding the deprivation of rights under color of law, and the judge's reaction was immediate and visceral. Thomas let out a sharp, bark-like laugh that echoed through the room. He shook his head, looking over at the court reporter as if they were sharing a private joke. "Section 1983? Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Where did you get that from, Mr. Monroe? Did you find a discarded law book in the park, or have you been spending too much time watching late-night television?" The bailiffs chuckled again, and a few people in the gallery stirred, uncomfortable with the blatant disrespect. Calvin remained unmoved. "The statute is clear, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and low. "It provides a civil remedy for the violation of constitutional rights by those acting under the authority of state law. My presence in the park was a peaceful exercise of—" "Stop right there," Thomas interrupted, slamming his hand onto the bench. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a movie, Mr. Monroe, and you are certainly not a lawyer. You're a man in a stained hoodie who couldn't even manage to leave a public park when the lights went out. Don't come into my courtroom and try to play constitutional scholar with me. It's embarrassing." Thomas turned to the prosecutor, a young man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Do you hear this? He's quoting federal code to justify loitering. I suppose next he'll be telling us he's an expert on maritime law because he once sat near a pond." The judge turned back to Calvin, his smile gone, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "I've been on this bench for 15 years. I know the law. You know nothing but what you've cobbled together to try and sound smart. It won't work here." Calvin took a breath, his expression unchanging. He was recording the arrogance, the dismissal of the law, and the utter lack of judicial temperament. "I am simply stating the legal framework that governs this situation, Your Honor." If you find the citation incorrect, I would be interested in hearing the specific judicial precedent that overrides it. Thomas's face flushed a deep red. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. You're interested in hearing? I don't care what you're interested in. I'm the one who asks the questions here. I'm the one who decides what's relevant. And right now, your citations are about as relevant as the weather in Timbuktu. He leaned over the edge of the bench, pointing a finger at Calvin. You think because you can read a few sentences on a screen that you're my equal? You're a defendant. You're here because you broke the rules. Now, sit down and shut up before I find you in contempt for wasting this court's time with your nonsense. The judge's laughter had died down, replaced by a visible, trembling rage. He had been caught in his own ignorance, and his only defense was to lash out. Calvin didn't sit down. He stood his ground, a quiet, immovable force in a room full of noise. He knew he had him. The sound of mockery wasn't just a sign of the judge's character, it was the sound of a system failing in real time, and Calvin was there to ensure it was the last time it happened in this county. Calvin didn't flinch as the judge's laughter died down. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet, lethal precision. He told Judge Thomas that if the court was going to dismiss federal statutes as nonsense, then perhaps they should look at the 3 cases the judge had adjudicated just that morning. Calvin pointed out that the summary judgment against the young woman with the hospital bills directly violated the ability to pay standards established in a landmark ruling from only 6 months ago. He watched the judge's smile falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Calvin didn't stop there. He began to dismantle the noise ordinance ruling, citing the exact page number of the updated state penal code that had rendered Thomas's interpretation obsolete as of the first of the year. The room grew so quiet that the scratching of the court reporter's pen sounded like a rasp. Thomas tried to cut him off, claiming that his court wasn't a place for outside interference, but Calvin kept talking with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a man who had memorized every footnote of the law. He asked the judge directly if he was familiar with the latest Supreme Court update on Fourth Amendment protections regarding public assembly. Thomas stammered, shifting in his seat, his face turning a blotchy, frustrated red. He tried to claim he had read the gist of it, but Calvin's next question forced him into a corner. He asked Thomas to explain the 3-pronged test the High Court had just implemented, a test that would have made every single one of Thomas's rulings that morning illegal. Thomas looked around the room, his eyes darting toward the prosecutor for a lifeline that wasn't coming. He admitted, his voice barely a whisper before he caught himself and shouted, that he didn't have time to read every little memo that came down from Washington. He claimed that common sense and local tradition were his guides, not the ivory tower theories of people who had never stepped foot in his county. Calvin noted the admission for the record, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. He was drawing Thomas into deeper water with every sentence, forcing him to show the entire room that he was operating on ego and outdated knowledge rather than the actual law of the land. The judge was now caught in a legal quicksand of his own making. The more he tried to defend his ignorance, the more he exposed his incompetence. Calvin pointed out that the common sense Thomas was so proud of was actually a series of constitutional violations that could trigger a federal audit of the entire county's records. The arrogance that had filled the bench all morning was evaporating, replaced by a visible, shaking panic. Thomas realized that the man in the hoodie wasn't just quoting statutes, he was reciting the very soul of the law with a depth that no backyard lawyer could ever fake. For the first time in 15 years, Judge Thomas felt the ground beneath his bench start to give way. Judge Thomas slammed his gavel so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. He leaned over the bench, his face a dark shade of purple, his veins bulging at his temples. He told Calvin that he didn't care about academic theories or what some clerk in Washington had typed up in a memo. He screamed that in this county, the law was what he said it was, and he had had enough of Calvin's pseudo-intellectual garbage. The judge's hand trembled as he pointed a finger directly at Calvin's chest, accusing him of coming into a place of gravity and trying to turn it into a circus. He demanded that Calvin apologize to the court immediately and admit that he was nothing more than a loiterer with a big mouth. Calvin didn't move an inch. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his expression remains as calm and unreadable as a deep lake. He told the judge that an apology would be a lie, as the only person disrespecting the court was the man sitting behind the bench who had abandoned his oath. The silence that followed was suffocating. The bailiffs stepped closer, their hands hovering near their belts, waiting for the signal. Thomas let out a low, jagged laugh, the sound of a man who had completely lost his grip on the situation. He told Calvin that he was giving him exactly 10 seconds to know his place and beg for leniency, or he would be spending the next 6 months in a county cell for criminal contempt. Thomas started counting down, his voice dripping with a mix of triumph and malice. He was banking on the fear that usually broke everyone who stood where Calvin was standing. He told the court reporter to make sure every word of the upcoming sentencing was recorded, wanting to make an example of this arrogant drifter who thought he was smarter than the system. Calvin watched the clock on the back wall, his eyes never leaving the judges. He didn't look like a man about to go to jail, he looked like a man who was watching a trap snap shut on someone else. When Thomas reached the number 1, he didn't wait for Calvin to speak. He stood up, towering over the podium, and ordered the bailiffs to take Calvin into custody. He told them to throw the book at him and to make sure he was processed with the high-risk inmates. Calvin took a slow, deep breath and spoke one last time before the guards reached him. He asked Judge Thomas if he was absolutely certain he wanted to proceed with the arrest of a federal official on official business. Thomas just laughed again, mocking the idea that Calvin was anything more than a nobody in a hoodie, and told the guards to drag him out. He had no idea that by uttering those words, he had just signed the warrant for his own removal. The bailiff's hand was inches from Calvin's shoulder when the room went unnaturally still. Calvin didn't pull away or brace for impact. Instead, he reached slowly into the front pocket of his faded brown hoodie. The movement was so deliberate that the guards hesitated, their training making them wary of a weapon. But what Calvin pulled out wasn't metal. It was a heavy, gold-embossed leather wallet. He flipped it open and held it toward the court reporter first, ensuring the small camera mounted on her desk captured every detail of the federal credentials. Judge Thomas was still leaning over the bench, his mouth open to deliver a final insult, when he caught sight of the identification. His face, which had been a flushed purple seconds ago, drained of color so quickly it looked like he had seen a ghost. Calvin didn't wait for him to speak. He turned his head toward the court reporter, his voice no longer just calm, but carrying a terrifying, authoritative weight that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He told her to strike the last 5 minutes of the judge's remarks from the active record and replace them with a formal notice of federal intervention. He stated clearly, for the transcript and the record, that Justice Calvin Monroe of the United States Supreme Court was now presiding over a preliminary inquiry into judicial misconduct. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The bailiff who had been about to arrest him backed away so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. Judge Thomas tried to stand up, his knees hitting the underside of the bench with a dull thud. He began to stammer, his hands shaking as he reached for his gavel, but he didn't dare use it. Calvin stepped closer to the bench, looking up at the man who had just threatened to throw him in a cage. He told Thomas that he had spent the morning documenting 14 distinct violations of federal due process and that the contempt charge Thomas had just issued would be the final piece of evidence in his removal. Thomas tried to mutter something about not knowing who he was, his voice high and thin, but Calvin cut him off without raising his voice. He told the judge that the law shouldn't require a man to wear a robe for his rights to be respected. He informed the room that this court was now under federal oversight and that no further cases would be heard until the Department of Justice team waiting outside the doors had secured every file in the building. As he spoke, the heavy doors at the back of the room opened, and 4 men in dark suits stepped in, their eyes scanning the room with professional coldness. The nobody in the hoodie had just turned the courtroom into a crime scene, and Judge Thomas looked down at his own hands as if realizing for the first time how fragile his kingdom really was. Judge Thomas slumped back into his seat, his eyes wide and vacant as the reality of his situation set in. The federal agents moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency, fanning out to the exits and the file cabinets before the local bailiffs even had time to process the change in command. Calvin didn't wait for the shock to wear off. He stepped toward the bench, his voice dropping into a register that made the room feel smaller. He told Thomas that a judge's robe wasn't a shield for personal insecurity or a license to bully the vulnerable. He began to list every ethical breach he had witnessed since the morning bell rang, from the denial of counsel to the illegal inflation of fines. Each point was a hammer blow to Thomas's career, delivered with the cold precision of a man who had spent his life guarding the integrity of the bench. The court reporter's fingers were trembling as she tried to keep up, but Calvin didn't slow down. He pointed out that Thomas had turned a center of justice into a revenue generator for the county, ignoring the very concept of due process in favor of ego and local tradition. He told Thomas that the common sense he had boasted about was actually a flagrant disregard for the Bill of Rights. As Calvin spoke, the federal agents began tagging the computers and sealing the paper dockets. Thomas tried to speak, his mouth working but no sound coming out, until he finally managed to whisper a question about why a Supreme Court justice would bother with a small-town courtroom. Calvin told him that the law doesn't have a size limit, that a violation of a citizen's rights in this room was just as significant as a constitutional crisis in Washington. The total collapse of the room's power structure was absolute. The prosecutor had backed into the far corner, hands raised in a gesture of non-involvement, while the bailiffs stood like statues, terrified to move. Calvin looked Thomas in the eye and told him that his biggest mistake wasn't mocking the man in the hoodie, it was forgetting that he was a servant of the people, not their master. He dismantled Thomas's legal standing in front of everyone he had spent years intimidating, stripping away his authority sentence by sentence. The federal lead agent stepped up to the bench then, handing Thomas a court order that effectively froze his powers and placed the entire district under federal receivership. By the time Calvin finished, Thomas looked like he had aged 20 years. He was no longer the grinning king of his own small world, he was a man facing the full, unyielding weight of the federal government. Calvin told him that the records being seized today would show a decade of systematic abuse, and that every case Thomas had touched that morning would be reviewed for immediate vacatur. He informed Thomas that the mockery he had used as a tool was now the very thing that would ensure his permanent removal from the bench. As the agents began escorting the staff out and locking down the chamber, the room felt lighter, as if the suffocating weight of Thomas's arrogance had finally been lifted, leaving only the cold, hard truth of the law behind. Judge Thomas didn't even wait for the federal agents to touch him. He stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and fumbled with the buttons of his black robe. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't undo the top fastener, finally just tugging the heavy fabric over his head in a desperate, clumsy rush. He left the robe draped over the back of his chair, a hollow shell of the authority he had abused for 15 years, and walked toward the side exit. No one in the courtroom looked him in the eye. The bailiffs, who had laughed at his jokes only an hour before, now stood with their backs turned, staring at the walls as if trying to erase their association with him. Calvin watched him leave, but there was no sense of personal triumph in his gaze. He turned to the lead federal agent and handed over the small digital recorder he had kept hidden in his hoodie pocket. He told the agent that the audio would match the court reporter's transcript, providing the necessary evidence of judicial temperament violations that would make the disbarment process undeniable. Calvin then looked at the people still sitting in the gallery, the ones who had come for justice and received only mockery. He told them that every case heard that morning was being stayed immediately, and that a special master would be appointed by the end of the week to review their citations. The relief in the room was palpable. A few people started talking in low, hurried whispers, the fear finally beginning to lift. Outside the courthouse, the humidity of the afternoon hit Calvin as he pulled the hood of his sweatshirt back. A black SUV with government plates sat idling at the curb. As he climbed into the back seat, his aide handed him a tablet filled with the afternoon's high court briefings, but Calvin didn't open them. He looked out the window at the small, struggling town, realizing that the cynicism that had been clouding his work in Washington was gone. He had spent months wondering if his high-level rulings actually reached the pavement, and today he had seen exactly what happened when they didn't. He knew now that his job wasn't just to interpret the law from a distance, but to ensure there was a mechanism to protect people from the bullies who wore its name like a costume. By the time the SUV reached the city limits, Calvin was already drafting a proposal for a new federal oversight initiative. He wasn't just returning to the Supreme Court to sit behind a bench, he was returning with a mission to bridge the gap between constitutional theory and courtroom reality. The judge's laughter had been a wake-up call, a reminder that the law is only as strong as the people who administer it at the local level. As the car sped toward the airport, Calvin felt a renewed weight of purpose. He had walked into that courtroom as a target of mockery, but he was leaving it as the catalyst for a reform that would ensure no one else in that county would ever have to stand silent while their rights were laughed away.
Thank you for watching this video. Hit the subscribe button, like, and comment to get more videos that deserves justice.